Miss Marple and the Murder at Mulberry Manor. Chapter 1. The afternoon sun slanted through the ancient oak trees of Mulberry Manor, dappling the expansive lawn with golden light. It was the perfect day for a garden party, the kind that Lady Sylvia Weatherby was famous for hosting. The villagers of St. Mary Mead had been looking forward to the event for weeks, their invitations carefully handwritten and delivered with a seal of quiet distinction. Long trestle tables draped in crisp white, linens were adorned with delicate china, crystal glasses, and tiered trays of sandwiches, scones, and petits fours. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the sweet aroma of honeysuckle and the sharp citrus of Lady Weatherby's homemade lemonade. A string quartet played light chamber music from the terrace, lending an air of refinement to the occasion. Miss Jane Marple sat slightly apart from the central gathering, enjoying the shade of a large chestnut tree, dressed in her usual understated fashion, a pale blue dress with a lace collar and a neat straw hat adorned with a single ribbon. She looked every bit the harmless elderly spinster she so often allowed people to assume she was. In reality, she was watching everything. A lifetime spent in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead had made Miss Marple an expert in human nature. She had seen it all before, the flirtations masked as innocent conversation, the petty rivalries hidden beneath tight smiles, the subtle undercurrents of long-held resentments. Nothing escaped her notice, though she rarely let on. Near the dessert table, young Evelyn Fawcett, Lady Weatherby's niece, giggled a little too loudly as Arthur Somerville leaned in to whisper something in her ear. He was handsome in a careless way, the sort of man who relied too heavily on charm and too little on substance. Lady Weatherby had made no secret of her disapproval of his interest in Evelyn, but Miss Marple had observed that disapproval often had the opposite effect on young people in love. Not far from them, the village doctor, Alistair Graves, was deep in conversation with Reverend Leonard Pettigrew. The two men often found themselves at odds. The doctor trusted in science, while the Reverend placed his faith in divine providence. Yet today, their discussion seemed amiable, though Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Graves kept glancing toward the house with a hint of concern. Lady Weatherby, as always, moved with an effortless grace, greeting her guests with a polite but distant smile. She was a woman of quiet authority, one who had long understood that power in a village was not measured by wealth alone, but by influence. Her husband had died some years ago, leaving her to manage Mulberry Manor and its affairs. She did so with an efficiency that many admired, though few truly liked her. The afternoon was unfolding exactly as expected, until the scream shattered the peace. The sound was sharp, raw, and filled with unmistakable terror. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Teacups clattered against saucers. All heads turned toward the house, where a maid stood in the open doorway, her face pale as parchment. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her apron, struggling to catch her breath. "Mr. Denim?" she gasped. He's dead!" A ripple of shock passed through the guests. Lady Weatherby's posture stiffened, her grip tightening on the back of a chair. "Dead?" she repeated, as though the word itself was an absurdity. The maid nodded frantically. "In the library, madam. He's been murdered!" For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, like a dam breaking, the guests erupted into frantic murmurs. The string quartet had stopped playing, their bows frozen mid-air. Murdered? Someone whispered in disbelief. Miss Marple did not move immediately. Instead, she let her gaze sweep over the gathered guests, noting their reactions. Who was shocked? Who was merely pretending to be? Who looked guilty? Mr. Denim. That was unexpected, James. Denim was not a particularly well-liked man. He had been staying at Mulberry Manor as Lady Weatherby's guest for the past month, though it was unclear what their exact relationship was. Some whispered that he had been involved in her late husband's business dealings. Others speculated that he had come to settle a debt. One thing was certain. His presence had unsettled more than a few people in the village. As the guests began moving hesitantly toward the house, Miss Marple placed her cup down with careful deliberation. A murder at Mulberry Manor. It was most unfortunate, of course, but it was also rather interesting. She adjusted her gloves, stood up, and quietly followed the crowd. Inside the library. The library at Mulberry Manor was a stately room, lined with mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Heavy curtains had been drawn back, allowing the afternoon light to spill in through tall windows. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its marble mantel adorned with an assortment of decorative clocks and porcelain figurines. And there, slumped in an armchair near the hearth, was James Denim. His head lolled to one side, his eyes open but unseeing. His usually ruddy complexion had turned an unnatural shade of grey. A teacup sat on the table beside him, its contents untouched. On the lapel of his jacket, a single drop of blood stood out, stark against the fabric. Dr. Graves stepped forward and bent down to examine the body. He pressed 2 fingers against Denim's wrist, though it was more out of habit than necessity. "He's dead," the doctor confirmed, his voice grim. "Has been for at least an hour." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. "What happened?" Lady Weatherby demanded, though she kept her voice composed. "I should think poison," Dr. Graves replied, frowning as he examined the untouched teacup. "But we'll know more when the authorities arrive. Poison." That single word sent a shiver through the room. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, noted the details. The cup, untouched, the single drop of blood, the absence of any sign of struggle. Poison was a subtle method of murder. It required patience, calculation. It was not an act of sudden rage, but of cold deliberation. Who, then, had wanted James? Denim dead? As the villagers murmured and exchanged worried glances, Miss Marple's keen mind was already at work. A mystery had unfolded before her, and she had every intention of solving it. Chapter 2. The oppressive weight of silence settled over the library, as the realization of murder sank into the minds of those gathered. Outside, the distant hum of conversation from the garden party had ceased, replaced by a thick tension that clung to the room like a fog. The guests who had once indulged in scones and gossip now huddled together, eyes flickering nervously between the lifeless body of James Denim and one another. Lady Sylvia Weatherby, ever composed, was the first to regain control. She turned toward the maid who had found the body, her expression impassive but firm. "Tell me exactly what happened, Alice," she instructed, her voice steady. Alice, still visibly shaken, wrung her hands in her apron. I was coming in to freshen the fire, madam." Mr. Denim had asked for the library to himself earlier, so no one disturbed him. But when I came in just now, I saw him sitting there, not moving. I thought he was asleep at first, but then I noticed—" She hesitated, eyes darting toward the bloodstain on his lapel. "Then I saw his face. It didn't look right, and I knew something was wrong." The guests exchanged nervous glances. Nervous. Some shifted uncomfortably, as though fearing their proximity to the body might somehow implicate them. Dr. Alistair Graves cleared his throat and straightened his posture, stepping away from the body. "It appears Mr. Denim has been dead for at least an hour, judging by the lack of any visible wounds, except for that small blood stain. I'd say poisoning is a strong possibility. However, we must wait for proper examination to be sure." "Poison?" Arthur Somerville, the young and charming yet frequently unemployed gentleman, scoffed. "Well, that's rather sinister, isn't it?" "Sinister and deliberate," Miss Marple remarked, softly, her voice carrying just enough weight to make a few people turn their heads. She had remained on the periphery, as was her habit, quietly observing. Now, as all eyes briefly settled on her, she gave a small polite smile before continuing. "Poison suggests premeditation. Someone planned this, which means it was no accident, no fit of sudden temper." Lady Weatherby's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting that one of us—" She stopped herself, composing her features into a mask of cool detachment. "This is dreadful, simply dreadful. I must send for the authorities immediately." "I shall do it," Reverend Pettigrew offered, eager to be of use. "Inspector Hamley is in the village today, I believe. It shouldn't take long." With a quick nod, he exited the room, leaving behind a thick air of unease. Miss Marple, ever patient, let the scene unfold before her. She had no intention of interrupting the natural reactions of those in the room. After all, people often revealed the most in the moments after a tragedy. The subtle shifts in demeanor, the anxious glances exchanged, the calculated neutrality some attempted to maintain. It all painted a picture, one she would carefully piece together. A web of relationships. The guests, now confined to the library at Lady Weatherby's insistence, began to murmur amongst themselves. "I can't believe this," Evelyn Fawcett whispered, clutching a handkerchief as though it might protect her from the horror of it all. "Who would do such a thing?" "Someone with a good reason," muttered Arthur Somerville, folding his arms. "And I dare say Mr. Denim was the sort to inspire plenty of grudges." Miss Marple took note of that. "Oh, and why would you say that, Mr. Somerville?" Arthur hesitated, but then shrugged. He was an unpleasant sort, wasn't he? Always poking his nose where it didn't belong, asking too many questions about Lady Weatherby's affairs. People like that tend to rub others the wrong way. Lady Weatherby's eyes flashed. "My affairs are hardly a matter of intrigue, Arthur." Arthur gave a casual smirk. "Of course, Lady Weatherby. I merely meant to say that Mr. Denim was curious, perhaps too curious for his own good." Miss Marple tucked that piece of information away. It was clear that Denim had been making inquiries, perhaps about Lady Weatherby, perhaps about something else entirely. Either way, curiosity in a small village could be a dangerous thing. Curious or not, the fact remains that he is dead, Dr. Graves interjected, frowning. "And if it was poison, that suggests that whoever did this had access to him, to his food or drink. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the untouched teacup beside Denim's body. "Quite so, Doctor. And given that this house has hosted a great many people this afternoon, it does make one wonder." "Wonder what?" Evelyn asked nervously. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression thoughtful. "Oh, just that. In my experience, poisonings are often personal. There is something very intimate about the method, wouldn't you agree? It requires a certain amount of planning, a knowledge of one's habits." She paused, then added in a bourgeois voice both light and firm. "And that means the person responsible is not some unknown villain lurking in the shadows. No, I rather think the culprit is someone quite familiar with Mr. Denim." A fresh wave of unease rippled through the room. The idea that the murderer was among them was no longer just a distant fear. It was a certainty. Miss Marple takes notice. As the discussion continued, Miss Marple silently took stock of the room once more. Who had the most to gain from Denim's death? Who had been visibly uneasy since the body was discovered? Who was trying a little too hard to look unbothered? Lady Weatherby had been quick to take control, but was that simply the instinct of a woman used to managing situations? Or was she concealing something? Arthur Somerville had spoken too freely, almost as though he was testing the waters. Was it bravado or guilt? Dr. Graves had been the first to declare poisoning, which suggested he was confident in his deduction. But why? Was he so certain? And Evelyn, poor Evelyn, who looked as though she might faint at any moment, was she truly horrified? Or was there something more beneath the surface? Then there was the matter of the bloodstain. A poisoned victim did not usually bleed, so where had that single drop come from? Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous mistakes were the small ones, the details overlooked by a guilty conscience, and in that room someone had made a mistake. She just had to find it. With quiet determination, she adjusted her gloves and settled in. There was much to uncover, and she had every intention of seeing the truth revealed. Chapter 3. The Library of Mulberry Manor, once a place of quiet refinement, had become a cage of uneasy whispers and darting glances. The air carried the faint scent of old books and polished wood, but now it was tainted with something less tangible: fear. The guests of Lady Weatherby's garden party had been confined to the house while they awaited the arrival of Inspector Hamley, yet no one dared to sit too close to one another. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace, observed the room with quiet attentiveness. People's reactions in the aftermath of a murder were always revealing. Some retreated into silence, others spoke too freely. Some feigned indifference, while others failed to mask their anxiety. And in a small village like St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of surfacing when one least expected. She noticed how Lady Weatherby remained poised, standing near the window, fingers lightly grazing the delicate lace curtain as she gazed out onto the garden. She had not shed a tear for James Denim, nor had she expressed any genuine grief. Instead, she appeared to be calculating something, as if running through a list of considerations in her mind. Arthur Somerville had taken up a place near the drinks cabinet, pouring himself a brandy with hands that were steady, too steady. A man with nothing to fear wouldn't need a drink so soon after a death. Evelyn Fawcett sat stiffly on the edge of a chaise lounge, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Every now and then, Her eyes flickered toward her aunt, as though seeking reassurance. But Lady Wetherby remained cold and distant. Dr. Graves, who had initially examined the body, stood near the doorway, his posture tense. He had declared poison with little hesitation. Perhaps the instincts of a seasoned doctor, or perhaps something more. And then there was Reverend Pettigrew, who had left to fetch the police. Miss Marple found herself wondering if he too had any secrets to hide. The waiting was always the most dangerous part of an investigation. It was when people had time to think, to construct lies, to align their stories. And Miss Marple had no doubt that lies were already taking shape in this very room, the last hour of James Denim. What exactly was Mr. Denim doing before he died? Miss Marple asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. Lady Wetherby turned from the window, her expression unreadable. He had excused himself from the garden party about an hour before his death. He claimed he had correspondence to attend to. Did anyone see him during that time? Alice, the maid, hesitated before speaking. I passed by the library once, ma'am. I heard the sound of papers shuffling, and I believe he was speaking to someone. But I didn't look in. It wasn't my place. Miss Marple's interest piqued. He was speaking to someone. Did you recognize the voice? Alice frowned, thinking. It was low, madam. A man's voice, but I couldn't say who. A man's voice, Miss Marple repeated, letting the words settle in the air. Lady Wetherby stiffened. Are you suggesting someone was with him before he died? Well, if he was speaking to someone, Miss Marple said mildly, it would be rather peculiar if he were alone. A silence followed. The implications were clear. If someone had been with Denim before his death, then that person was likely the last to see him alive. Arthur Somerville swirled his brandy lazily. Plenty of people have hushed conversations at these sorts of events. Doesn't mean they ended in murder. Miss Marple gave him a pleasant smile. No, of course not. But it does mean someone in this room is withholding information. The tension in the library grew thicker. The bloodstain mystery. The door swung open abruptly, and Inspector Hamley entered with 2 uniformed constables behind him. He was a stocky man with a thick moustache and a no-nonsense demeanor. He had investigated many a case in his career, but he had learned never to underestimate the sharp mind of Miss Marple. Right, then, he said gruffly. Let's get to the heart of this business. A man dead, you say? Poisoning? Dr. Graves stepped forward. I believe so, though we'll need a proper examination. Inspector Hamley approached the body, examining the scene with keen eyes. Strange thing, though, that blood stain on his lapel. If he was poisoned, why would there be blood? The same question had been circling in Miss Marple's mind. A poisoned victim didn't usually bleed, which meant there was an additional element to this murder. Could he have been struck before he died? Evelyn asked timidly. Dr. Graves shook his head. There's no sign of external injury apart from that single drop of blood. It doesn't fit. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Unless, of course, Mr. Denim bled from something small, something as minor as a prick from a needle. A hush fell over the room. A needle? Arthur frowned. Are you suggesting he was injected with something? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet satisfaction. "It's a possibility, isn't it? A swift, barely noticeable prick, perhaps while he was distracted. A fast-acting poison. It would explain the sudden nature of his collapse and the single drop of blood." Inspector Hamley rubbed his chin. If that's the case, then the method was deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Dr. Graves. A doctor, after all, would know which substances could kill quickly and quietly. But then again, so would a chemist, or even a well-read individual. And if poison had indeed been injected, then the murderer had to have been close enough to administer it without Denim realizing. The first suspect. "Let's be direct about this," Inspector Hamley said, crossing his arms. "Mr. Denim wasn't killed by some passing stranger. That means someone here had a reason to want him dead." A murmur of protest rose from the guests. Lady Weatherby's voice was sharp. "Inspector, I assure you, I have no reason to—" "But he was asking questions, wasn't he?" Arthur interrupted, his casual demeanor slipping just slightly. "I heard him more than once, poking into things best left alone. Maybe someone didn't like what he found." Inspector Hamley narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly was he looking into, Mr. Somerville?" Arthur hesitated, then glanced toward Lady Weatherby. A flicker of something passed between them. An unspoken tension. Miss Marple observed it keenly. There was something being left unsaid. Finally, Arthur shrugged. "You'll have to ask Lady Weatherby that." A sharp intake of breath followed his words. All eyes turned to Lady Weatherby. The stately woman's expression remained calm, but Miss Marple noticed the faintest tremor in her fingers as she clasped them together. Whatever James Denim had been investigating, Lady Weatherby knew exactly what it was, and Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that it was the key to everything. Chapter 4a. Heavy silence filled the library at Mulberry Manor. Arthur Somerville's words had landed like a thunderclap, and all eyes were now on Lady Sylvia Weatherby. She did not immediately react, maintaining the air of quiet authority that had served her well for years. But Miss Marple had been watching her closely, watching the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers pressed together just a little too firmly. James Denim had been asking questions, and Lady Weatherby had the answers. Inspector Hamley adjusted his stance, his expression shrewd. "Lady Weatherby, would you care to explain what Mr. Denim might have been investigating?" Lady Weatherby lifted her chin. "Inspector, if Mr. Denim was involved in some inquiries, I was not privy to them." Miss Marple's keen eyes twinkled. "Oh, I rather think you were, Lady Weatherby." The older woman turned her gaze to Miss Marple, her lips pressed into a firm line. "And what precisely do you think he was looking into, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I wouldn't presume, but it does seem quite likely that whatever Mr. Denim discovered, or was on the verge of discovering, was significant enough to warrant his murder." Arthur Somerville took a sip of his brandy, now fully invested in the drama. "Well, that much is obvious, isn't it? The man was a nuisance. He kept asking questions, poking around, and now he's dead. Quite convenient for some people." Lady Weatherby turned to him with a sharp look. "Are you implying something, Arthur?" Arthur only smirked. "I'm merely stating facts." Miss Marple had heard enough vague accusations for now. Facts were what she needed, and there was one fact that still puzzled her. She turned to Dr. Graves. "Doctor, about the poisoning. If Mr. Denim was injected with something, as we suspect, how long would it take for the poison to take effect?" Dr. Graves frowned, considering. "That would depend on the poison. Some act within minutes, others take longer. If he was found dead in the library an hour after excusing himself, then I'd say the poison was fast-acting, perhaps a matter of minutes." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Which means that whoever administered it must have been with him very shortly before his death." Inspector Hamley's eyes narrowed. "That brings us back to Alice's statement. She heard a man's voice in the library, but she couldn't say who." A new wave of tension rippled through the room. The men present, Dr. Graves, Arthur Somerville, Reverend Pettigrew, who had just returned from summoning the police, and even the inspector himself, were now all silently considering one another. "Well, I certainly wasn't in the library," Arthur said quickly, before anyone could suggest otherwise. "Nor was I," Reverend Pettigrew added, adjusting his clerical collar. "I spent most of the afternoon in conversation with Lady Wetherby and Miss Fawcett." Lady Wetherby confirmed this with a stiff nod. Dr. Graves, however, remained silent for a moment longer than expected. Inspector Hamley pounced on it. "Dr. Graves, where were you in the last hour?" The doctor hesitated, then exhaled. "I was in the study, going over some notes. I had intended to discuss a medical matter with Mr. Denim later in the day, but I never got the chance." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she stored that information away. A vague answer was often a telling one. The missing link. "You say you were going to speak to Mr. Denim about a medical matter," Miss Marple said, her tone casual. "Would that have had anything to do with his health, Dr. Graves?" Dr. Graves looked at her sharply. "I don't see how that's relevant, Miss Marple." "Oh, I think it might be very relevant," she replied pleasantly. "You see, if Mr. Denim was unwell, or if he had recently received a certain kind of diagnosis, then it might explain why someone would want him silenced before he could reveal anything." Evelyn Fawcett gasped. "You think someone killed him because of something he knew about his own health?" Miss Marple smiled kindly at the young woman. "Not necessarily, my dear. But a doctor often knows things about his patients that they may not wish others to know. And if Mr. Denim was investigating something, well, I do wonder what he might have uncovered." Dr. Graves stiffened. "I am not in the habit of discussing my patients' private matters." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course not. But then we don't know that Mr. Denim was your patient, do we?" A charged silence followed. Inspector Hamley's eyes darkened. "Dr. Graves, are you telling me there's something about Denim's medical history that you haven't mentioned?" The doctor hesitated, then finally sighed. "Very well. I'll admit that Mr. Denim came to me some weeks ago, asking for certain medical records." "Records?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "What sort of records?" Dr. Graves hesitated again, but Miss Marple could already sense the answer forming. She decided to nudge it forward. Would these records happen to involve someone in this room? Dr. Graves swallowed. Yes, a collective intake of breath. Inspector Hamley straightened. "Who?" Dr. Graves glanced at Lady Wetherby, then at Evelyn Fawcett. Then, after a moment, he sighed. Mr. Denim was looking into an old medical file, he admitted. one concerning a child born in this household over 20 years ago. Miss Marple's heart quickened. A hidden family connection, a buried past, and now a murder. Lady Weatherby's face had gone ashen. Evelyn, sitting beside her, suddenly looked at her aunt with wide, questioning eyes. "A child?" Evelyn whispered. But who?" Miss Marple already suspected the answer, and so did Lady Weatherby, because, for the first time that evening, her composure faltered. Her hands, which had been so steady before, trembled as she reached for a chair. Inspector Hamley caught the movement. "Lady Weatherby, what aren't you telling us?" The elegant woman closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The child," she said, "was mine." A stunned silence fell over the room, and Miss Marple knew this was the secret James Denim had uncovered. But was it the reason he had been killed? Or was there still more to discover? Chapter 5. For a long moment, the only sound in the library was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. The revelation had stunned everyone into silence. Even Inspector Hamley, who had undoubtedly heard his share of family secrets, looked taken aback. Lady Weatherby, usually composed and unshakable, stood with her hands clasped tightly together, her face pale. Her confession had altered everything. Evelyn Fawcett, her niece, or perhaps not her niece at all, stared at her, wide-eyed. "You had a child?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lady Weatherby hesitated before nodding. "Yes." Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the tension in her shoulders, the way she braced herself as if expecting judgment. But judgment was not Miss Marple's way. Truth was. "Then I suppose," Miss Marple said gently, "the question that follows is, what became of that child?" Lady Weatherby took a slow breath. She was a woman who had spent years mastering control, and even now she was unwilling to let her emotions betray her. "The child was taken away," she said finally. "It was not a situation I could have managed at the time." Arthur Somerville scoffed. "Oh, how delicately put." Lady Weatherby shot him a sharp look, but did not rise to the bait. Inspector Hamley, regaining his composure, crossed his arms. And James Denim, he knew about this. Lady Weatherby nodded, though reluctantly. "He came to me several weeks ago, asking questions. He said he had come across some old documents. He believed they were linked to me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. "And did he tell you how he came upon these documents?" Lady Weatherby hesitated. "No, only that he was trying to set things right." A curious phrase, Miss Marple thought. It suggested that Denim had not merely stumbled upon information, he had been seeking it. The lost heir. Evelyn, who had been sitting motionless, suddenly spoke. "Aunt Sylvia," she said slowly, her voice shaking, "is it me?" Lady Weatherby's eyes widened. "What?" Evelyn clutched at her handkerchief. "Am I your child?" A gasp rippled through the room. Miss Marple observed Lady Weatherby closely, noting the shock that flickered across her face. But no, that wasn't quite right. It wasn't shock. It was hesitation. "No," Lady Weatherby said at last, though she did not meet Evelyn's eyes. "You are my brother's daughter. That has always been the truth." Evelyn exhaled shakily, but doubt still clouded her face. "Arthur, ever the cynic, raised an eyebrow. "Well, if it wasn't Evelyn, then who was it?" Lady Weatherby's silence was telling. Inspector Hamley tapped his fingers against the desk. "Lady Weatherby, I must insist that you tell us everything you know. If Mr. Denim was investigating your past, then it's quite likely that he was killed because of what he found." Lady Weatherby sighed, finally sinking into a chair. "I had a son," she admitted, "born out of wedlock." Another murmur passed through the room. In Lady Weatherby's social circles, such a scandal could have ruined her. "I was very young," she continued. "I had just come out into society. My father arranged for the child to be sent away. He would not have a scandal in our family. I was forbidden from speaking of it." Miss Marple nodded. "And you never tried to find him?" Lady Weatherby looked stricken. "I did. Years later I tried. But the records were missing. The trail had gone cold." Inspector Hamley frowned. "And Denim, he found something." Lady Weatherby pressed her lips together. "Yes, he claimed to have located my son's birth records. He wanted money to keep the matter quiet." A murmur of shock ran through the room. "Blackmail?" Dr. Graves asked. Lady Weatherby nodded stiffly. "He said he would make the information public if I didn't cooperate." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "And did you pay him?" For the first time, Lady Weatherby's composure cracked. "No," she whispered. "I refused. I told him that if my son were alive, I would rather find him than bury the truth in secrecy." Her voice trembled slightly, and Miss Marple believed. Her Arthur Somerville leaned back thoughtful. So, Denim had an interest in this missing heir. And now he's dead. Rather convenient, wouldn't you say? A new theory Inspector Hamley exhaled. "So, let's consider this. Denim uncovers a secret, one that someone wanted to keep buried. If Lady Weatherby didn't kill him, then who else would have wanted him silenced?" Miss Marple tapped her finger against the arm of her chair. "Perhaps someone who had more to lose if the truth came out." Arthur frowned. "More to lose than Lady Weatherby?" Miss Marple smiled lightly. "That depends on who the child is, doesn't it?" A tense silence followed. Then Evelyn spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aunt Sylvia, do you know who your son is?" Lady Weatherby hesitated again. Then, slowly, she looked across the room, her gaze settling on Dr. Graves. The doctor's expression darkened. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Is it, Doctor?" Dr. Graves scowled. "I am not Lady Weatherby's son." Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged. "No, I don't believe you are." Dr. Graves blinked. "Then why?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "But you do know who he is, don't you?" The entire room seemed to freeze. Dr. Graves stiffened. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. Lady Weatherby's breath caught. "Alistair," she whispered. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Dr. Graves, you're a man who deals in records. Medical records, birth records. You've had access to them for years. And yet you never mentioned anything about Lady Weatherby's child until now." Arthur let out a low whistle. "Well, well." Inspector Hamley straightened. "Dr. Graves, what do you know?" The doctor hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a deep sigh, he finally spoke. "I know that James Denim was right," he admitted. "Lady Weatherby's son is alive." A fresh wave of shock rippled through the room. Lady Weatherby's hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Where?" she asked breathlessly. "Who is he?" Dr. Graves clenched his jaw. He was raised under a different name. He never knew who his real mother was. Miss Marple's voice was soft. "But you knew?" Dr. Graves shut his eyes briefly before nodding. "Yes." Inspector Hamley's voice was sharp. "Then tell us, Doctor, who is the missing heir?" Dr. Graves exhaled. Then, after a long pause, he turned to Arthur Somerville. Arthur's smirk faded. Dr. Graves spoke clearly. "It's you." A collective gasp. Miss Marple, however, merely smiled, because she had already suspected as much. But now came the most pressing question. Was Arthur the heir to Mulberry Manor? Or was he the killer of James Denim? Chapter 6. Arthur Somerville did not move. For the first time since the murder, his usual smirk had vanished, replaced by something colder, calculating. He looked around the room, as if expecting someone to object, but no one spoke. Even Lady Weatherby, pale and rigid, simply stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. Miss Marple, ever patient, watched his reaction carefully. A man who had just learned he was the long-lost heir of Mulberry Manor should have been stunned, overwhelmed, even emotional. But Arthur? He looked like a man caught in a dangerous game. "Arthur?" Lady Weatherby breathed, as though saying his name aloud might make it more real. You are my son?" Arthur finally blinked, tilting his head. "Well, that's quite the revelation, isn't it?" Dr. Graves spoke, his voice weary. "Yes, you were given away as an infant, raised under another name. I came across your birth records years ago, but I never thought it was my place to interfere. Until now." Arthur exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "And Denim, he found out, didn't he?" Inspector Hamley crossed his arms. "It seems that way. And the moment he started asking questions, he wound up dead." His eyes darkened, "Which makes this all the more interesting." Arthur chuckled, but there was no humour in it. "Now wait a minute, Inspector. Are you seriously suggesting that I killed Denim because he told me I was the heir to all this?" He gestured vaguely at the grand manor around them. "That's hardly a motive for murder." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Oh, but perhaps you didn't want him to tell anyone else." Arthur's jaw tightened. Lady Weatherby's hand flew to her chest. "But why?" she whispered. "Arthur, my dear boy, if I had known, if I had found you sooner." Arthur's expression hardened. Would it have changed anything? His voice was quiet but sharp, filled with an anger that had been simmering for years. "Would you have come running to find your long-lost son? Or would you have kept living in this grand house, pretending I never existed?" Lady Weatherby flinched, and for a moment she looked genuinely wounded. "Arthur, it wasn't like that, wasn't it?" Arthur laughed bitterly. "You didn't try very hard, did you?" Miss Marple studied him. There was something in his voice, not just anger, but resentment. A man who had spent his life believing he was entitled to more. A man who had never quite belonged. Inspector Hamley, unimpressed by Arthur's theatrics, leaned forward. "Enough dancing around the matter, Somerville. Did you or did you not speak to Denim before he died?" Arthur met his gaze, eyes unreadable. No. Miss Marple's head tilted ever so slightly. She had expected a denial, but she also expected the smallest sign of hesitation. There was none. Either Arthur was telling the truth, or he was a very good liar. A sudden realization occurred just then. Evelyn Fawcett, who had been silent throughout the revelation, stood abruptly. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "That's not true." Arthur frowned. "What?" Evelyn clutched her arms around herself. "I saw you, near the library. You were speaking with him before, she swallowed hard, before Alice found him." The room turned sharply toward Arthur. Miss Marple watched him closely, waiting for his response. Would he deny it? Make an excuse? Show fear? Arthur's expression barely changed. He only sighed. "Fine. Yes, I spoke to him, briefly. He had more questions, and I was getting tired of answering them." Inspector Hamley's expression darkened. "And what did you talk about?" Arthur shrugged. He wanted me to confirm a few things. He suspected, but he didn't have proof. He thought I was the lost heir, but he needed something concrete. His lips curled slightly. "Which, I suppose, he'll never get now." Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately caught the significance of those words. "He'll never get now." It sounded almost satisfied. The missing piece. "You seem remarkably unbothered by all this, Arthur," Miss Marple said softly. "A man who had just learned his entire life was a lie might be a bit more shaken." Arthur gave her a long, steady look. "Miss Marple, some of us don't have the luxury of a comfortable little village life where everything is simple. Some of us learn early that life doesn't care about fairness." "Is that why you killed Denim?" Inspector Hamley pressed. Arthur's smirk returned. Now, Inspector, if I had killed him, why would I still be here?" Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "Because you didn't think anyone could prove it." Silence. Arthur's smirk faltered just a fraction. Miss Marple took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts. She had been piecing things together all evening, but now she saw it clearly. The timing, the method, the motive. "I believe," she said softly, "that James Denim was killed because he was getting too close to the truth. But Arthur, I don't think you're the one who poisoned him." Arthur blinked. "What?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, you had the motive, certainly, but you lack something quite important." Arthur scoffed. "And what's that?" "The means," she replied. "The poison was administered in a way that suggests knowledge of medicine or chemistry. Required precision." She turned her gaze elsewhere. Dr. Graves, the room collectively shifted their attention. Dr. Graves stiffened. "This is absurd." Miss Marple tilted her head. "But it does make sense, doesn't it? You had access to medical supplies. You had access to records Denim could have uncovered. And most importantly, you had every reason to ensure that Arthur never learned the full truth." Lady Weatherby's breath hitched. "Dr. Graves?" Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You knew about Arthur all along, didn't you? You knew who he was. You could have told him at any time. But you chose not to." Dr. Graves clenched his jaw. "I had my reasons." Miss Marple nodded. "Oh, I'm sure you did. You saw Denim as a threat. If he had revealed Arthur's identity, then Arthur would have had a claim to Mulberry Manor. And I do wonder, would that have affected your position here, Doctor?" Dr. Graves's lips pressed into a thin line. Inspector Hamley stepped forward. "Are you telling me that Dr. Graves killed Denim to keep Arthur from inheriting?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It would appear so." A heavy silence fell. Dr. Graves exhaled through his nose. "You're a very sharp woman, Miss Marple," he admitted. Then, after a moment, he straightened. "But it won't matter." "Inspector," Hamley tensed. "And why's that?" Dr. Graves smiled, and then, before anyone could react, he reached into his coat, a vial, small, almost unnoticeable. Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Stop him!" But it was too late. Dr. Graves uncorked the vial, swallowed the contents, and within seconds he collapsed. A stunned silence followed. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "Poison," she murmured. "How fitting." Lady Weatherby covered her mouth. Evelyn let out a strangled gasp. Inspector Hamley cursed. "Well," he muttered, "that's one way to end a case." Arthur, still in shock, let out a breathless chuckle. "Guess I really am the heir, then." Miss Marple, watching him, did not smile, because she still wasn't quite certain Arthur was innocent, and something told her. This mystery wasn't over yet but Chapter 10. The trial of Arthur Somerville concluded swiftly, as justice in England was known to do when a case was so thoroughly laid bare. The evidence had been overwhelming, and though Arthur had confessed, his demeanor in the courtroom had been strangely detached. He had not begged for mercy, nor had he denied the crime. Instead, he had worn a faint smirk, as if resigned to the irony of it all. He had finally learned his true identity, only for it to be the very thing that sealed his fate. The sentence was passed, life imprisonment. Lady Weatherby had been absent from the proceedings, choosing instead to retreat into solitude. The scandal had wounded her pride, but more than that, it had broken what remained of her heart. Evelyn Fawcett sat stiffly in the courtroom when the final ruling was made, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face betrayed no visible emotion, but Miss Marple, seated quietly a few rows behind, noted the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly. As the gavel fell, sealing Arthur's fate, the whispers began anew. The villagers of St. Mary Mead thrived on scandal, and this one would live in their memories for many years to come. But for Miss Marple, the mystery was not over. There was still one question left unanswered. A last visit to Mulberry Manor. A week after the trial, Miss Marple found herself once again at the gates of Mulberry Manor. The house had been emptied of its grandeur. The usual hustle of servants and guests had been replaced by an eerie quiet. The gardens were overgrown from neglect, and the heavy wooden door creaked as the butler let her in. Lady Weatherby sat in the drawing-room, dressed in mourning black, though she had lost no one to death, at least not in the traditional sense. She had aged years in mere weeks, her once dignified composure replaced by something wearier, more fragile. "Miss Marple," she said with a faint smile, "I suspected you might come." Miss Marple set down her gloves and took a seat. "I thought it only proper, my dear." Lady Weatherby nodded, gazing into the dying embers of the fireplace. "So is this where you tell me that I must forgive myself?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think only time can do that." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Lady Weatherby spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was my son, and yet I did not know him at all." Miss Marple sighed, folding her hands in her lap. "No, I suppose you did not." Lady Weatherby inhaled sharply, as if steadying herself. "Do you believe that had I raised him, he might have been different?" Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "Perhaps. Perhaps not. We are all shaped by our choices as much as by our circumstances." Lady Weatherby let out a bitter laugh. "Then what does it matter? If fate was always going to lead him down that path?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "Because knowing that does not make his sins yours, Lady Weatherby." Lady Weatherby's lips parted slightly, as if she might argue, but she said nothing. Instead she turned back toward the fire, her eyes distant. The final clue, Miss Marple, waited a moment before speaking again. "There is something I wish to ask you," she said softly. Lady Weatherby looked at her warily. "Yes?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did Arthur know?" Lady Weatherby blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Did he know before Denim told him? Did he know that he was your son?" Lady Weatherby hesitated for too long. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I rather think he did." Lady Weatherby exhaled sharply, her hands tightening over the arms of her chair. "How did you know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Because he was never surprised." Lady Weatherby's breath caught. Miss Marple continued, "When you learn something so life-changing, there is always a moment of disbelief, a moment of shock. But Arthur never once reacted as though he had been given new information. He played his part well, of course. He acted as though the news was unexpected, but his body betrayed him. His eyes never widened, his voice never wavered. That kind of control only comes from someone who has already made peace with the truth." Lady Weatherby looked away. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Arthur was many things, Lady Weatherby. A liar, a thief, a murderer. But more than that, he was an opportunist. He was waiting for the right moment, wasn't he?" A long, painful silence, and then, finally, Lady Weatherby whispered, "Yes." Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but she did not look away. "Lady," Weatherby swallowed hard, "I suspected it months ago. There were little things. The way he looked at the house, at me. He was always watching, always waiting. And then Denim arrived, and I knew he would put the final piece together." Miss Marple nodded. "And that is why you did not stop him." Lady Weatherby let out a shaking breath. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of what the truth would mean. Afraid of what he would do." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I failed him, Miss Marple. I failed him long before he ever took a life." Miss Marple reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "You failed him, yes, but you also loved him." Lady Weatherby let out a quiet sob, but this time she did not try to hide it. The end of Mulberry Manor, Miss Marple, left Mulberry Manor as the sun began to set, casting the house in golden hues. The estate would soon be sold. Evelyn Fawcett now, the sole heir, had no desire to live within its walls. She had already begun making arrangements to move elsewhere, far from the ghosts of the past. Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked back at the house one last time. It was a beautiful place, but some places, no matter how grand, could not escape their history. And Mulberry Manor's history would forever be one of secrets, betrayals, and a son who never truly belonged. With a quiet sigh, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and made her way back to the village. She had solved another mystery. But as she walked down the winding lane, she knew that somewhere another mystery was already waiting for her, because after all, human nature never changed, and neither did Miss Marple. End.